Thank you all for joining us today and for being members of the museum. I'm Jory Sheriff, Senior Manager for Membership Initiatives, and I can't say this enough, your support as members has truly helped sustain our work and helped keep the museum open during a very difficult year. And we're very grateful, not just for your generosity, but also because you attend our virtual events and programs. It really keeps us motivated and inspired, so thank you. Today, I'm honored to introduce our very special guests, Dr. Robert Jan van Pelt and Dr. Michael Berenbaum. They are world-renowned Holocaust scholars and the lead curators of the groundbreaking exhibition, Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, currently on view at the museum through May 2nd, 2021. I know many of you joined as members while we were closed, or maybe you haven't had a chance to visit. So this program will give you sort of behind the scenes glimpse into the exhibition from the two people who helped create it and who know it probably better than anyone. So we'll save about 10-15 minutes at the end of the program for member questions. So Robert, Jan, Michael, thank you so much for being here with us today. Whenever you're ready, let's get started.
Yes, hello to everyone. I just want to say especially to Daphne Geismar, my friend Daphne Geismar from New Haven, who wrote this beautiful book, Invisible Years, about her family, and also has given a presentation already, I think, at the MJH, one of the programs. But also especially to my friend Catherine, who I've never met, but who drove today from Rhode Island to the museum, and I think is sitting in the Garden of Stones right now to watch this program, and then is after the program going to see the exhibition. So I hope that, you know, it's not that at 2 p.m., Catherine, that you will get up and walk out of the museum and go to a bar to get drunk because it was a terrible presentation, but that you will still feel inspired to basically look at it both through your eyes and maybe also a little bit through our eyes. So, of course, my friend Michael is sitting in LA. I don't know if he had his coffee already, but it's early morning there. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Robert.
So, Michael, the problem is Michael is that he talks a lot. And so he promised me he was going to basically, it was 2/3 Van Pelt, 1/3 Berenbaum. But I guess if any of you keeps a stopwatch, then we can, at the end of the meeting, we can compare notes on that. And I don't know if we bet a good bottle of wine on this, but I will hold you that 1/3. Okay. So I have, basically, we have prepared slides. And the slides, in some way, some of you may have seen already a program I did like a year ago, and it will seem almost, and you should see now my slide deck, but I'm going now into the program itself, and you should see right now a title, Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away. And basically, Michael and I edited this slide deck yesterday, and we're going to talk about it. So Michael, immediately, I showed this title and you suggested to add to the title what's in the name. So it's all yours right now.
The question becomes, Auschwitz is a universal symbol. And part of what this exhibition, and its universal symbol, it's virtually synonymous with the Holocaust for reasons that are well known. It was the largest and the most lethal of the camps. It was the most complex of the camps, Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, Auschwitz III. And Robert came up with the idea that Auschwitz was not long ago, not far away. And I would say that we wish that it were far away, but we want to share with you an absolutely obscene cartoon, which essentially, take a look at that, and we'll test you at the end of this presentation on what's not only what's substantively wrong with the cartoon, but the degree to which they've essentially united two different iconic images of Auschwitz to make a point that you're being misled when they tell you that vaccines are safe and it's a path to freedom. It's the equivalent of Arbeit macht frei. Last point is, we live in a world in which somebody puts on for an insurgency Auschwitz staff. And the rumors were that somebody also had 6 MWE, 6 million wasn't enough. So those of you who imagine that Auschwitz was far away and long ago, sadly, that may really be the opposite of truth, a bitter falsehood.
Yeah, so just to correct you on one thing, it was actually Paul Salmons who came up first with the name Auschwitz. This did our title, and we immediately thought it was a great title for all the reasons that you have said. So the story really begins with Viktor Frankl. This book, Man's Search for Meaning, which many of you will have read, or at least will have heard about, over 2 million copies sold in this particular edition. And Michael, tell me your relationship to this book and how this in some way triggered the exhibition.
Well, the exhibition was created by Lori Ferraro and Musella in Spain. And essentially, he had lost his brother. He read Man's Search for Meaning, and it moved him profoundly. And he is an exhibition creator. And he said, in the aftermath, I need to do something about the Holocaust. And I need to do something in particular about Auschwitz. What's remarkable is Louis is not Jewish, and Louis is from Spain. And remember, Spain was one of the very few European countries that did not participate in World War II. It had been exhausted by the Spanish Civil War. So this exhibition was the brainchild in its inception. He's the father of the exhibition, was the brainchild of a man who was suffering personal grief, who read about the Holocaust and then said, I need to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. So here we are together so this is not the whole curatorial team, but this is our first meeting. It's in San Sebastian, Spain, and you see Louis is sitting to the complete left. And as you see, he's a young guy and decided, without any, let's say, call it investment or in the topic, that this is what he wanted to do for the next decade. His uncle, Josian, is to the right. He is in some way the business manager. And then you have the three in the middle is Jamel Zaniti, our designer and architect. And then Michael, of course, sits in the middle, and then myself. And then 2 other curators joined shortly after, my wife, Miriam Greenbaum, and Paul Salmons, who also has a lot of relations with the museum right now. And what is really nice about this, the way to work, is that when you work with a private company, the first thing is that the number of stakeholders are very few. I mean, the Auschwitz Museum became a partner, became a stakeholder, but we basically could make all the decisions literally around that table. It was not done with grants and so on. This was all done with basically bank loans. It was the credit of Louis and his uncle that was basically on the line. So we had actually incredible liberty to work. And I think, Michael, when you worked in creating the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I guess that the situation was quite different when you had to conceive of that museum.
Oh, no. Look, most exhibitions are created for museums that pre-exist. This, in a sense, was a private company. And consequently, even in the work we're doing now for the Museum of Jewish Heritage, we have a SAG, a bag, and a MEG that we have to go through each time we begin to articulate an exhibition. A museum committee, a board committee, and a scholarly committee. And the process of verification and getting it through is always complex, and that's without political pressures. In Washington, we had a much more complex arrangement. This was smooth, this was quick, this was well. And the other thing, Robert, you and I know very well, which is a museum exhibition is really a team effort. Mm-hmm. You can be the father of this exhibition, and you are, because there are very few, perhaps no one in the world who knows Auschwitz better than you. but you're interrelated, interdependent on a team, and we had a wonderful team. We not only worked well together, we actually even liked each other.
We liked each other.
Doesn't always end up that way.
So when we actually so Louis came to me, and then I went to invite you, and one of the reasons that that when I went to you and I said, Michael, would you like to join us, because we need a rabbi. And every team organizing an exhibition on the Holocaust or Auschwitz needs a rabbi. And I just wondered what went through your head when basically this was my reason for asking you. How did you see that the particular role that we thought you could contribute?
Look, on my self-examining roles, I like to be part of the soul of an exhibition. An exhibition can be magnificent and can lack soul. I try to bring soul to the exhibition. So when you, Robert and I go back a very long way, when you turned to me, I said, let's go.
Okay.
Between Robert Jan van Pelt and Auschwitz and Robert Jan van Pelt, it's an offer I couldn't refuse.
Okay, so let's go. So the first question we had to answer is, why would anyone want to go to an exhibition when you actually can go to the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum itself? And of course, this is the Arbeit macht frei gate. This is on a very early morning. But the typical situation, of course, when you go there is like this. And when you go into the buildings, because the exhibition is inside the buildings, typically for, I would say, 5 months a year, the conditions inside the buildings is like this. And so there is something in an exhibition that there are a number of things that you can do. And for me, it is the incredible opportunity that you have for storytelling in a kind of controlled environment, like sitting around a campfire. Auschwitz is very large, and quite often also the logistics of getting people through the site, through all the buildings, in some way becomes quite involved. And in an exhibition, I think the way to focus the visitors on the topic itself is a little easier. Now, I don't know if you fully agree with this, Michael, or if you would like to add to this.
But let me correct one word. It's very important that we distinguish Auschwitz. We don't go through buildings; we go through barracks, which is those buildings used to be barracks, and consequently, you're going to a site that has an authenticity and must maintain integrity all of its own. The second point is that, Robert, you and I deeply agree on the idea that an exhibition should be a storytelling exhibition. And the difference, the greatest instrument of storytelling in the world today is film. And the difference between a museum exhibition and film is, in film, you have a captive audience and moving imagery. In an exhibition, you have a moving audience and captive imagery. And consequently, you have to have the power of the story that drives the visitor from one image to another, to a third, to a fourth. And part of what we did with this is, for those who cannot go to Auschwitz, we bring Auschwitz to you. And that is that we allow you to visit it in places that most people will not get to. If 2 million people a year visit Auschwitz, and there are billions of people on this earth, then this is an opportunity for us to go to place after place and bring the story of Auschwitz to the people. And that, in fact, was enormously compelling to the museum at Auschwitz as the reason they would cooperate.
Yeah. Now, one of the issues, of course, is that this exhibition is not an exhibition that we can replicate in many different, simultaneous versions, because we work with artifacts, and that was immediately also a question we posed, and we had to answer: were we actually going to work with artifacts, original artifacts or not? Because, of course, artifacts means that we had no collection to start with. And we needed to get, first of all, the Auschwitz Museum as a partner, but also families of survivors or Holocaust centers which had artifacts from survivors. And so here we have an artifact that, of course, is very iconic, basically a bunk bed from Auschwitz I. This is actually from the, let's call it the early period in the camp, when prisoners still got these kind of relatively comfortable bunk beds, I would say. They were not produced in Auschwitz anymore once the Jews started to arrive en masse here, as it was exhibited in Madrid, and of course also in the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Now, Michael,
let's also help our visitor by saying one basic thing. Auschwitz was 3 camps: Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, Auschwitz III. Auschwitz I was the early camp. It was mainly a Polish slave labor camp. Auschwitz II is known also as Birkenau, which was the death camp. And Auschwitz III was Bunamanowitz, which was a complex of slave labor with a vast industrial complex that was there. And we try to represent all 3. This is the early stage, when you see people are sleeping individually. Later, you will see bunks in which people are sleeping together, so much so that if one person turns, everybody has to turn. And then there was a question of where do you sleep, and you needed energy to get to the top. But if you slept at the bottom, you had the risk of being disturbed by everyone else. So even where you slept was a question of basic survival.
Yeah, so now we basically have, and Michael, you suggested to include this slide, so I will let you talk about the 4 issues.
Museum 101. Museum 101 answers 4 simple questions: what, where, with what, how. What do you have to say? What is the story you want to tell? Where are you telling it? You tell it differently, for example, in Auschwitz than you do in Jerusalem, differently in Washington than you do it in New York, different in Berlin than you do in Budapest. With what is the question of artifacts, but also video and text and all of the modes of communication. And we'll see that. And then how is the question of basic design? How do you tell the story? But simple questions yield very complex answers.
Yeah. So what story do we seek to tell? So let me just walk through this. The way we decided to tell it is actually to go back in history to in some way root the story in the site. And that was also part of the result of earlier work that I had done. So we show a 16th century map of the Duchy of Auschwitz to show this was a real place, and this was the major reason, because Auschwitz has become a metaphor for so many people. And I will just go quickly through it to look at the history of the town itself, which was well known as actually a quite prominent Jewish town in the 19th century. It was the most as far as Polish Hasidic movement was concerned, it was the most western outpost of that, on the border with Germany. We discuss how the railway arrived in Auschwitz. That becomes, of course, later very important. The impact of the First World War, after which the border moves, the new independent state of Poland is created, which also has implications for the history of the town which is basically in the bottom left corner. And you see there are a lot of railways. These are these blue lines converging against on Auschwitz. And then placing it in a history of German fantasies about building an empire in the East, that there is a sense of a mission, the same kind of mission Americans felt they had in the American West in the 19th century, an open frontier. which leads then to the invasion of Poland in 1939. The idea that Poland really was a state that ought not have existed, that it was something against the flow of history. The annexation then of the western part of Poland, inclusive of the town of Oswiecim, into Germany. So it becomes now a German town, and this is then a road sign of that. The creation of a concentration camp first for Polish prisoners to terrorize the local Polish population into compliance with the German occupation. And this creates then a regime of terror. And then the arrival of big companies in the town, which brings money into the Auschwitz camp, at least to the Kommandantur. This is the share of the IG Farben company, the second largest corporation in the world in 1941. The largest was Standard Oil of New Jersey, to create a very large synthetic rubber plant in the town of Auschwitz. And this was very important because the Germans had no access to natural rubber. And then ultimately the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, basically the beginning of a war without any prisoners taken against the Soviet army, this defined as subhumans, and that spills over that creates then a large camp for Soviet POWs, basically next to the original Auschwitz camp in a site called Birkenau. And then the decision in January 1942 to basically murder all of the Jews of Europe. It wasn't really that decision taken there, but basically discussions were held there of how to do it, who was going to be included or not at Wannsee. And then basically...
Let's also say Wannsee in American parlance had some of the best and the brightest. 15 men were around the table. They represented normally the number 2 people in large bureaucracies like the Justice Department and the Foreign Justice Ministry and the Foreign Ministry, officials of the party, officials of the army. 8 of them had doctorates. 8 of them had doctorates. Only 2 were above 50 and most were in their 40s and 30s. Yeah. They had come far and fast in a society that normally didn't allow young people to come forward that quickly. And they weren't asked the question whether to kill the Jews. They were told how they were going to kill the Jews. And complicity was the name of the game. And SS intimidation was part of the story.
I understand they had a nice lunch in between their meetings and some drinks after the first day. Eichmann testifies on that. In any case, Auschwitz, after that meeting in Wannsee, basically is going to be part now of what the Germans call the final solution. And it's getting transports from all over Europe, but particularly from Western and Southern Europe. And this is in some way the difference with Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, other major extermination camps, which in some way were more directed towards the murder of the Jews of Eastern Europe. So Auschwitz also in the time of the Cold War, when the Iron Curtain separates Western Europe from Eastern Europe from 1945, maybe 1948 to 1989, because so many of the survivors in Western Europe basically had survived Auschwitz. It also becomes very important in Western Europe as a symbol of the Holocaust, more important than it was in some way in Eastern Europe.
But let's also add one other thing, which is if you look at those, you understand the importance of the railroad that was introduced about a century earlier. Yeah. Because Auschwitz had 44 parallel railroad tracks. And that meant that because of the nature of what the town was, it meant it could receive people from throughout Western and parts of Eastern Europe, and they all could converge on Auschwitz. The infrastructure was there. Yeah. If you contrast that with, for example, Treblinka. Treblinka was located on the Warsaw-Białystok line, and it took Jews from Warsaw and Białystok as one of its primary populations 265,000 Jews were shipped there between the 23rd of July and the 21st of September 1942. Belzec was located on a small rail line, but Belzec itself was a regional camp that killed some 434 to 500,000 Jews in 10 months, arriving 1, 2, 3 transports a day. Auschwitz, again, because of where it was located and because of its infrastructure, the railroad becomes important. And it also sets one other metaphor up that you have to understand, that in essence, they were making the victims mobile and the killing centers, factories, and assembly line, factories of death. And we'll see that evolve in a moment.
So just to quickly, so this is the Auschwitz area. In the exhibition, you will see it. Most important camps is the Auschwitz main camp. In the bottom left, and you have Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest part with over 100,000 inmates to the extreme left, and then Auschwitz-Monowitz to the right. And then that's located next to the IG Farben plant. And I will just come quickly, so every one of you will notice the images of the selection, or in this case of Hungarian Jews in 1944, and then ultimately the murder of the majority of them shortly after arrival in the crematoria. And we have here an image by David Allaire. But I would like to go.
Let's say one word. Let's say one word about David Allaire. David Allaire was a member of the Sonderkommando who was an artist. And this is an example of where he used his art as testimony. And one of the reasons we do this is exactly the way in which he drew it in 1945. And let's notice one other incredible item here, which is that the gas for murder was brought by Red Cross trucks, not trucks run by the Red Cross, but the Germans, the Nazis put Red Cross trucks on, Red Cross symbols on the trucks to give a sense that this was a medicalized killing. And it was essentially, one of the metaphors was essentially the Jews were a cancer. This was a medicalized process. And the deception was Red Cross trucks brought the gas to the gas chambers.
And this is also what Himmler at a certain moment says, and even Hitler, that, what is the issue with the final solution? It is a measure of public hygiene. One thing which is very important for me, when I was involved in the Irving trial and testified in London, Allaire is very important because he makes these drawings, very important testimony about the crematoria in 1945 before any other information is available. This is basically directly based on his own experience, his own memory, and it's not cross-referenced to a literature because that literature doesn't exist yet. Yeah, and this is one of the issues when you're looking at testimony that comes 30, 40 years later. The question is always a little bit of how much actually does a survivor really remember, and how much the survivor in some way may have picked up since 1945. But this very early testimony is absolutely crucial because Allaire had no one else to compare notes with, basically. He drew this in Paris immediately after his return. And so in that sense, you could say it was uncontaminated. Now, the big issue, of course, the big difference that we had from Michael when you were working on the Holocaust Museum in the 1980s, and when we were working in the past decade, is that you had a collection to work with, and we didn't have a collection to work with. Of course, the museum in New York does also have a collection to work with. And would you like to reflect on the differences as a curator? Because I've never really worked with a collection. I'm now working on an exhibition based on a collection, but you had a collection to work with already in the 1980s.
Well, you're exaggerating a little bit. We essentially started with a very small collection, and then we began the art of collecting. We began the art of collecting by asking survivors to contribute and to donate what they had. And then we ran into an incredible piece of luck because Eastern Europe was in turmoil in the late 80s. Everybody had bet their future on their contact with the Soviet Union. We came along as an American project when Europe was about to turn, when Eastern Europe was about to turn to the West. We came along on a Jewish topic, and they thought they had met the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and we weren't going to tell them otherwise. And consequently, we went to Eastern European countries with a shopping list of what we needed in order to tell the story. So a good museum always builds its collection, and then you have to have a tension between, does the museum tell the story of its collection, or does it tell a story and use its collection to illustrate the story it wants to tell? And consequently, we in Washington years ago essentially went with a shopping list of what we needed to tell the story, got the major artifacts, the anchor artifacts, as we'll see in a moment, and then built off of that with all of the other material that you need. And over years, we've developed, as the Museum of Jewish Heritage has developed, a significant collection that now can carry the bulk of telling the stories that you want to exhibit. But figure it this way, the storytellers want to tell a story. The curators always want to tell the story of their collection. And the difference with a historical museum is that you have a story to tell where you need to use whatever material you have, the collection. In our case with Auschwitz here, we had no collection, therefore we had to beg and borrow, negotiate and partner. And part of the exciting thing is hunting for images. As you know and I know, it's one of the innovative, detective, and curious, we'd even say fun parts of the job.
Not exactly with this particular image.
Not with this picture.
This is an image of a massacre in 1941 in Ukraine. And for me, very important, not only because of what it depicts, and obviously these people are not going to live much longer anymore. It's a very intimate picture also. But for me also, it's very important that you actually still see the film strip. You see actually that this is in some way the sense of the artifact of the film itself. This is not a neutral image. And quite often when you see them in books represented and so on, you only see the image part, but you do not anymore see, I think, the technology that, this was really a person with a camera and a film with 36 images or 12 images in his camera. And then you have to tell the story of that somebody developed that film and somebody actually enlarged the pictures. All of the mechanics and the collaboration of many different people to actually allow this photo to exist. All of this is also told by this particular image.
And if you're going to call this as an art piece, and I don't mean it, God forbid, as an art piece, you'd call this Mother with Children.
Yeah.
And all three of them were dead within an hour or two.
Yeah. So you try to find images, and of course nowadays one of the really big problems is you go online and it's very easy to find images, but then the question is, how do you find images of a sufficient resolution that you can actually exhibit them and blow them up? And this is the big problem, that we in some way have, if I'm thinking about myself, that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has a great collection of images that they make available, but quite often, there are issues of rights also. This one was very difficult actually ultimately to get a file that was large enough for us to actually use. And so the problems of getting good images has changed. If it was maybe before the internet, just simply to know what would be out there. Now we have a better sense what's out there, but quite often you get this incredible, frustrating kind of battles to actually get the right image, because people are copying each other and so on. And you also have to look at the price. Getty is very expensive, and you want maybe to use another supplier, and so this is a full-time job really in the whole thing. But here we have again, of course, quite an important image for me, because it's one of the undressing rooms in Auschwitz, which again I think stresses that you know, in the Holocaust, this was a genocide primarily of women and children. In some way, when you start with it, normally, of course, in wars, traditionally, even savages and barbarians will spare women and children, but not in this case. And this is why, again, for me, both images are very powerful.
Robert, let's move and quicken the pace, please.
Okay, so the artifact hunting. So we have artifacts that are used historically, artifacts that are used symbolically. So historical artifacts is in this case, a diary. Somebody who's been liberated from Auschwitz writes a diary in 3 languages. It's about his in some way, he starts to making a new life. He has to learn English and German. And so he goes from Yiddish to English to German. And so this is a document about starting a new life, but he writes in it about his own experience in Auschwitz. But then in the exhibition, and this is in the Madrid version, we have an artifact that is used purely symbolical. It is a wheel set for a German locomotive, a freight locomotive from the 1930s. And so this artifact stands in for the railway system, but also for the German state, in a sense, for the whole network and system of perpetrators. And sometimes we have artifacts that can be both symbolically and historically relevant. These are an actual gas mask used in Auschwitz in the crematoria by the SS. But of course, a gas mask like this also has a very strong symbolic value, because in some way the face is hidden behind it. There is a sense here of the kind of the dehumanization, not only also of the victims, but the voluntary dehumanization also for me of the perpetrators. So for me, this is a very important artifact because history and symbolism come together.
And in a good exhibition, we build it like a symphony, which is something is presented early on and then it's developed, and it's like a theme comes in and you have a theme and variations. And here, again, you use glasses, which are a deeply personal item because many of us carry our glasses. Many of us cannot see clearly without our glasses. It's something we're aware of all the time. And here they took these because they recycled them. And again, one set of glasses has a power where the multitudes, the individuality of them gets lost.
Yeah. And so we use the glasses, for example, in the room that deals with the gassing. In some way, of course, glasses, eyes, you know, we had the gas mask before, where in some way the eye becomes invisible. And of course, these in some way stand in symbolically for the eyes that don't see anymore. Now, very important also is that you need to simultaneously in an exhibition, you need to confirm expectations, and you need in some way surprise people. So when you go to an Auschwitz exhibition, the visitor will expect suitcases with names on it, like this one. Now, the Auschwitz Museum actually doesn't lend them. They didn't want to lend them to us because they in some way, there's a problem of really who is the rightful owner of these things. So these items that are associated with particular individual, this was a Kurt Stein, a doctor from the Czech Republic, from Pilsen. So basically, they cannot leave Poland. But you need to have those kind of artifacts, but also like this road sign of Auschwitz. Of course, this is something people don't expect. They don't expect that Auschwitz was a town, that it was a town that the Germans were developing with road signs and a mayor and a civil service and so on. And so you need to simultaneously work with this idea of confirming expectations, surprise people, and then also do it maybe in a single document that does both at the same time. Everyone knows about the Auschwitz orchestra, the inmate orchestra, but when you actually see a symphony by, I think this is one by Haydn, and you see actually the music, and for us all of this of course represents, it's an abstraction of beauty, of enjoyment, and then you see the stamp on it of the inmate orchestra of the concentration camp Auschwitz, you know, when you finally see that, then the contradiction between the bars with the music and then the stamp of the Auschwitz orchestra on it is quite violent, and for me very, very thought-provoking. I don't know, Michael, if you want to add to.
No, I'm anxious to keep us moving because, Robert, I know what we have at this moment.
Unique artifacts and artifacts that appears to be extra. So this is by Alfred Cantor. It's in the museum's collection. It is a image of the women's camp with the chimneys of the crematorium smoking at the back. There's no other thing like that in the world. But then, of course, here also two other artifacts, and these are a talit katan, a small talit that an observant Jew, Mendel Landau in Auschwitz, used at the risk of his own life, and a shofar. And I just wonder, Michael, if you would like to maybe comment on these the sense of the aura of these pieces.
Well, the shofar again is incredibly important because it was taken from Canada. Canada was the place where they gathered after they confiscated everything. It was snuck out of Canada. It was given to someone to be blown on Rosh Hashanah, which meant that Jews were cognizant of time and cognizant of the High Holy Days. And there were religious Jews and even secular Jews who wanted to observe it as an act of defiance. Poetically, the shofar is also a very important artifact for another reason. Symbolically, you have one full blast, which then breaks apart into three, which then breaks apart into nine. So you go from whole to fractured to shattered. And then you conclude with the great blast at Ki Agdola, in which it is whole again. And the other is this is supposed to pierce the heavens and turn God's indifference into compassion, reminding God of the Akedah. So the idea that this was blown at Auschwitz, and this came to us a little bit late in the exhibition, but we added it because of its importance. And we wanted to demonstrate that even in the depths of hell, people had the capacity to believe, or if not believe, at least defy.
These artifacts. They are in some way when the Auschwitz Museum, when we were looking for artifacts in the Auschwitz Museum, they at a certain moment said, "Do you want some buttons?" And said, "Your buttons?" I said, "Yeah, we have all these buttons." And so we said, "Okay, let's get some buttons." And so they said, "Do you want 1.5 kilos of buttons?" I said, "Okay, 1.5 kilos of buttons." We didn't know how many buttons that would be. And so when they arrived, every button was in its separate little pouch with a number on it. So this is how the Auschwitz Museum is taking care of it. This is not for them simply that there's a big bucket of buttons. And so for us, these buttons, for me, they became very important artifacts because, you know, they're a little bit like faces. They're all the same and they're not the same. Every button is kind of unique, and every button is also similar to others. So for me, the human condition became very, very much reflected in the button. Now, I know the grandson of Rudolf Höss, Rainer Höss, and Rudolf Höss was the commandant of Auschwitz. And Rainer Höss is a young man, or now middle-aged, who really hates his grandfather for what he did, and his grandmother also, who lived in Auschwitz in the commandant's house. And he came to Toronto 3 years ago, and I was talking about these buttons. And we were having breakfast. We were doing a program together in one of the Toronto schools. And he says, you know, there's actually a very interesting thing about the buttons. And he told me the story about his grandmother, that is the wife of the commandant, Rudolf Höss. And she would send people from the household to go to selections when selections came from good countries like the Netherlands or Belgium or France, where they assumed that there would be more wealthy Jews on the train. And then when they saw people go through the selection who were wearing nice clothing, they basically tracked the clothing, and after people had to undress, they would ensure that these pieces of clothing were brought back to the main camp where there was a tailor shop, that these clothing would be then repaired if it needed repair and cleaned, and this was then made available to the household of Rudolf Höss. So it was given to the children, that is the father and the uncles and aunts of Rainer Höss. And so then Rainer Höss told me this one detail which absolutely shook me when I heard it, and it still shakes me when I talk about it, that Mrs. Höss insisted that when a garment was going to be cleaned and repaired and going to be delivered to the Höss household, that all the buttons would be replaced. And for me, that in some way is, I think, the best illustration of the power of these tiny little artifacts.
Robert, let's push forward a little bit.
Artifacts that relate directly to Auschwitz, to artifacts that indirectly relate to Auschwitz, examination table, used for medical procedures in Auschwitz, and of course we use it as a way to discuss Dr. Mengele. Artifacts we use that we got from other collections, like the Spungen collection, the postcards sent from a concentration camp in Germany in the 1930s to talk about the creation of concentration camps. And then finally a tallit of a man who was born in Oswiecim, the town where the camp was created, ultimately murdered in Auschwitz, but his tallit was saved because his children, when they went into hiding, he gave his tallit to his children. And I don't know, Michael, if you would like to in some way give a little bit of the nature of a presence of a tallit of a person who was murdered in Auschwitz in an exhibition, because I think
let's move forward a little bit, Robert.
Yeah. Okay, big artifacts, small artifacts. Lucky find, an original. Jamel was actually our designer. Heard about this freight wagon in Germany, and when he went out to see it, this is after the restoration. He found that this was actually a freight wagon of the kind used for the deportation of Jews of the right date. As you can see here, this was made in 1940. So good enough for us as it was. And then here, as it is still displayed, but there's a new fence around it at the Museum of Jewish Heritage.
And in the ideal way, were we creating de novo, we would bring the wagon into the museum, we would open it, and you would walk through it between the ghetto and the concentration camp. But again, museums have walls, and you cannot make the perfect the enemy of the good. And you can't quite get this in. When we got it in Washington and in other museums, which I've worked in, we put the train in and then we sent the concrete for the next floor. So the one thing we can guarantee is none of these trains can get out of the museums. And if you remember earlier, we showed you the way in which the train was used symbolically at Yad Vashem, which I think they made a mistake by not integrating it into the exhibition. And people remember in Washington, the train as one of the major elements of their experience. Same thing in places like Illinois and Mexico City, where the train, Dallas, Texas, where the train, Houston, Texas, where the train is an essential part of the exhibition. Let's go on, Robert, because we have about 15 minutes left.
Yeah. So
this is a great story.
This is a great story. Yeah. So this is we needed. It's like a shopping mall. You need to have you need to have Macy's or Hudson Bay to anchor it, and we wanted to have a original Auschwitz barrack to anchor it. But the Auschwitz Museum lent an original barrack to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I think that's the first and last time they did it. But the interesting thing about the Auschwitz area is that much of the area where actually the camp operated is not part of the Auschwitz Museum. So in the neighborhood, within, let's say, a 10 square mile radius, there are a lot of remains of the camp. And an important thing about these barrack huts was that they could be transported, they could be taken apart and re-erected somewhere else. And in 1945, many Polish peasants who came back to the Auschwitz area and found that on their old lands was now a camp, or the remains of a camp and a big rubber factory, they were given half a barrack by the Polish government, half in this case, Auschwitz-Monowik barrack, to make a new beginning, to make a new start. And so basically through the help of a local taxi driver, Vladislav Malarek and his son Piotr, who know everyone in the neighborhood, we found actually this barrack that was erected in this little lot close to Auschwitz-Monowitz in 1945. We have the man here who is the son. He actually came back in 45 to Auschwitz. His father had been a peasant in the area. They were giving a little plot of land to start again. And he lived now in Krakow, and this was still his little plot that he had of a garden. And this old barrack was basically a chicken coop. So we were able to first of all, we identify it, we authenticate it, we bought it. And ultimately, this becomes, so we had it restored, and of course, all kinds of permissions, because it's an historic artifact, to be able to export it from Poland, and the Auschwitz Museum again helped us with it. But this is now one of these big artifacts that anchors the exhibition, and which is also a great thing, is that it allows us to exhibit within it. The other thing is, of course, the tiny artifacts. So we need a big artifact, but sometimes tiny artifacts tell also incredible stories. And Michael, I wonder if
we should say there are large stories and small stories, and that is that part of what a small artifact is, especially if you know it, is that it tells a very particular story of a very particular person. And in this case, it tells the story of a dreidel, which is Hanukkah, which a kid probably brought with him in his suitcase and was part of what you had. And therefore, we're able to tell stories large and small. There's something about walking into an authentic barracks that allows you to see life in the camp very differently than if you merely look at it in your room or in a wall with a clean carpet and something very nice and comfortable around it. And then there's something about looking at the particular. We can show you 1,000 shoes, but if you see one child's shoe, all of a sudden you remember exactly what was there.
Yeah. Now we're 5 minutes to 2. I don't know, Tori, if you would like us to stop and maybe take some questions. I think we have.
Well, I'm gonna pick up the questions, Robert. Let's continue quickly a little bit.
Okay, so again, a very small picture in our exhibition of one family in Krakow. And this was a picture taken in 1938, and only one person was still alive in 1945. The second person from the right, Jacob Berenbaum, and we have a couple of artifacts from him in the exhibition. And so this then brings us to the next problem. They're artifacts with stories. It means these are artifacts quite often contributed by survivors and their families, and artifacts that come without the story, but that invite analysis. So this is an artifact, a box. We know who created it, a Polish patriot named Bronislaw Czech, who was in the camp. He was a wood carver, and especially for the SS, they asked him to carve these boxes, of course, for free, but this was the way he got a little bit better treatment. We know the whole story. He was an Olympic skier before the war. But then here we have an artifact that doesn't have a story. This comes from a pile of shoes in Auschwitz. But in some way, what we can do is in some way pull out the story. We can ask questions about this shoe. And this is what the audio tour does. The audio tour in our exhibition always asks the questions. Do you want anything to add to the importance of shoes in Holocaust exhibitions, maybe?
Well, I always think of Moshe Schulstein's poem, "We are the shoes of grandchildren and grandparents from Paris, Prague, and Amsterdam. And because we are made of fiber and leather and not of flesh and blood. Each one of us survived the hellfire, which again gives you the sense of they gathered the shoes, they preserved the shoes, they killed the people.
Yeah.
We've been at, let's do 3 more slides, Robert, and then I'll ask you a couple questions, or we'll both ask each other a couple of questions.
Okay, so historical artifacts specially produced for the exhibition, historical artifact, big cooking pot from Birkenau, so you can talk about food in the camp, and then a model, because we cannot take the crematorium, it doesn't exist anymore, from Auschwitz, we represent it in a model. Or in this case, we reconstruct something that no one has ever seen since end of 1944, a gas column that allows us to explain how the Zyklon B was introduced in the gas chamber. So specially produced for this exhibition. This is together with another exhibition I did, the only 2 gas columns in existence in the world right now. And
let me give Robert enormous credit. Robert is an architectural historian. And in the details of this, you see something absolutely profound about the gassing process. In one sense, the crematoria at Auschwitz, especially crematoria 2 and 3, were misdesigned because gas was introduced at the top. When gas is introduced as the top gas rises, it's less effective. So here they built a double cage, and you lowered the gas from the top in a basket, and you then put it at the bottom, and the gas rose from there, the Zyklon B rose from there. And then at the end of 30 minutes, when everybody was dead, you could pull it out and therefore reuse the gas chamber a little bit later on, because it didn't take that much time to evacuate the gas. And in this particularity, you see the way in which the entire gassing process worked. Robert, I'm going to turn us for a couple of seconds to some questions very quickly. I will send you on the website the poem about the shoes. We were asked an impossible question, Robert, and with this we can move toward conclusion. We're asked by a fellow that I've met, Breitenbach. Perhaps what would you wish a visitor of the exhibition take away with them and internalize? You have 30 seconds, Robert, and counting.
I think we end with actually a poem by Charlotte Delbo, which basically tells people to appreciate their life. It is about do something with your life. I think it would be too terrible for all of these people to have died in this terrible way if we didn't do something with it. And whatever you do with it, I think that is basically the answer you have to formulate. But I think that ultimately this exhibition is actually a celebration of life, and it's a celebration of resilience. It's a celebration of pain. It's a celebration of deep tragedy, but also of incredible strength in people. And so that is what I would hope that people would take away from it.
Let me have one more word, Jory, and then you can. I like to think of an exhibition as concluding with a challenge. And if I go back, there is a good couple at Sachsenhausen who introduced arriving prisoners to what they were about to face. And he concluded his speech to them with the following words: I've told you this story not to weaken you, but to strengthen you. Now it's up to you. And I believe in both sides. We want you to go through and learn this story, not to weaken you, not to cause you, not to shatter you completely, but now it's up to you, and it's up to all of us to transform ourselves and the world so that we don't have an Auschwitz again, and again and again.
So I see also now the chat. I don't know, Jory, can we go a little longer or?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually one question that's not in the chat that I think would be great for you both to sort of illuminate. This member asks, do you think we can learn from the perpetrators of genocides? And from a curatorial and educational standpoint, how do you balance that with the experience and the perspective of the victims? So how do you navigate this tension? How do you honor the victims while also learning from those who commit these heinous acts?
Again, Robert, 30 seconds or less.
There is no balance. There is no balance there, except that of course both are human beings, and in some way you see the range of a way of standing in the world. Because I'm an architectural historian, I came into the topic of Auschwitz in some way through the architect's mind. I was interested in the architects who designed it. That means that I was very much focused on the perpetrators initially. And in some way, that is still my great question, because I train architects, I educate architects. I don't want them to become like the architects of Auschwitz. So this is my professional bias in some way in the story. While I would guess that Michael's professional bias, the way he came into the story, also because Michael had worked on basically the work of Elie Wiesel and so on, would have been very different. But in the end, we are part of the same conversation, I think.
Let me say 4 things very quickly. Number one, Robert created an exhibition called The Evidence Room that was in the Biennale in Venice. And it had a tremendous opening sentence. The Biennale is a celebration of architecture. And he wrote the greatest crime that architects ever committed. And part of what we have to look at when we look at the perpetrator is we have to look at about the people who were explicitly perpetrators, who were distant perpetrators, for example, desk killers who did nothing more deeply than sign a piece of paper and consign 100,000 or 500,000 people to death. The bureaucrats, in that sense, Eichmann once said, essentially, look, I never killed anyone. I provided the trains for transport. What happened at the other end of the train is not my responsibility. And I remembered my math teacher in college, who was a very famous entertainer, Tom Lehrer, said, we send up the rockets, but where they land, that's not my department, said Werner von Braun. Which is, we have to look at those who did nothing else but facilitate it. Today, we have to look also at the enablers and those who thought they could achieve other parts of their agenda by going along with this process, those who were complicitous, those who benefited from it. And we both follow the idea that the most frightening thing about all of this is that the perpetrator were human beings, like you and like me. And I think we both agree that they were ordinary men who, under extraordinary circumstances, became effective and efficient and professional killers. And that diminishes our optimism about the human condition, but empowers us to seek to make people so repulsed by the experience of the perpetrator without running out of the museum screaming, so repulsed by the experience of the perpetrator that they understand that they have to be responsible one for another, compassionate one for another, and accepting of the diversity of human beings, and not, again, divide us, destroy us, stigmatize us, etc., etc. Back to you, Jory.
Thank you. We see some questions in the chat, but I'll go ahead and ask the ones that are not. Robert Jan, you touched upon this earlier with your story about the buttons, which was incredible. This is along those lines. is there a particular artifact that either of you found emotionally just particularly moving or tragic, something that really has stayed with you?
Michael, do you want to go first?
I'll tell you, one about the perpetrators that I found extraordinary is there was a from the Weimar, from the Wiener Library, there is a man who went through town after town after town in Germany and photographed all of the exclusionary signs, no Jews allowed, etc. And I found that interesting because I remember going down south as a young man, and I worked in the South during the early civil rights movement, and seeing those signs in America. In fact, I remember a story of no Jews and no dogs allowed, and I had a black cab driver, and I said, why do they have that? He said, well, if they don't allow Jews and they don't allow dogs, they certainly won't allow, in those days, he said, Negroes there, so they don't even bother. And that became very important to me. The other is I'm deeply moved by the religious artifacts. And the last thing I'm always moved by are the postcards, because I got an assignment about 5 years ago. Somebody approached me and asked me if I would write an introduction to a postcard collection. And I said, what the hell do you want me to write an introduction to a postcard collection? And then I read the manuscript. It was called Hate Mail. And postcards are what we want to share in public. They're sold on little stands. They're put in the mail. The postman sees it. You see it. It's something we're proud of that we want to share. It's something wonderful to look at. And all of these postcards that are anti-Semitica are stuff that moves me in an important way. And obviously, the last thing that moves me are the shoes.
And especially there is the shoe with the sock still tucked in it. There is this thing I had the pleasure of taking a number of tours, a lot of tours through the museum while the exhibition before COVID came in, and the last one was also with the Cardinal Archbishop of New York and the Secretary General of the UN. And it's remarkable. These are
not that he's name dropping.
Not name dropping, but in some way these are people of the world. I mean, of course, you cannot say that an archbishop of man of the world, but these are people who have seen a lot. I mean, these are people of incredible experience and thoughtfulness. And in both cases, when you come to the shoe with the sock that we did display just before in the room that is about the gassing itself, they fall silent and they want to spend time with that object alone. And the reason, of course, is that the incredible betrayal that the Holocaust represents. It was betrayal upon betrayal or betraying or betrayal. It was lie upon lie upon lie upon lie from the very beginning. Yeah. And of course, in that sense, it is kind of a very contemporary story, sadly enough. I mean, the whole history of fascism, of Nazism, is a history of lies. And of course, the last lie of that whole sequence is a mother with a little son or daughter coming in the undressing room of the crematorium right in front of the gas chamber, and basically it's not only the SS man or the Sonderkommando says, undress. You will going to be showered and you will come out of it and you will have another life. But in some way, the mother who becomes part of the lie, who tells to the son or daughter, take off your shoes, put your socks in the shoe that you can find them again, tie them together, put them at this number. So it is for me heartbreaking that object, because all of those 12 years or 10 years of lies upon lies comes together in that act of putting the sock in the shoe and ultimately knowing it was all for nothing. It was all part of a deception.
Jory, let me answer two questions very quickly. David Bell asked the question, is there a book that came out of the exhibition? And I want to show the book. It's called Auschwitz. You won't believe it, not long ago, not far away, which Robert compiled. And it's available and it's worthwhile. And I think it's a very, it's another way of taking the exhibition with you, even if you can't visit the exhibition. We're also asked where it's going to next go. It's next going to Kansas City, and there are discussions as to where it's going to go afterwards. We as curators would prefer, for example, that go to Paris, because we'll unfortunately have to go to Paris at that point, or the like. But we're hoping it will go out to a public that needs to see this in places that don't necessarily have Holocaust museums, as certainly not as good as the Museum of Jewish Heritage, but that it will be available as another way of reaching the American people and the world.
There's one question in the chat, if you have time for one more, that touches upon some other comments that members have made. What aspects of Auschwitz or the Holocaust in general are in need of further research or exposition, given how well documented it is? And I know that that's a very large question, but you can expand a little.
26 years ago, 27 years ago, I edited a book, which was the opening conference of the Research Institute of the Holocaust Museum. The Holocaust, the unknown, the known, the unknown, the disputed and the re-examined. And the most interesting thing that Robert and I both face is that however much we think we know, we can't keep up with our field because there is so much more to know. And qualities of books are being brought out literally every week. I'm just going to show you as an example. This is a book that was featured last week in the New York Times. It's called The Ravine. It's by Wendy Lauer, who's a scholar of the Holocaust in Ukraine. And she literally built the entire book on the examination of one photograph of the mobile killing units. Taught us how to see the photograph in 10 different ways and what it represented, and used the photograph as a way of discussing what happened in one town on one day to one community and ultimately to one woman with 2 children, which takes a very particular photograph and uses it to open up to the whole. We are finding new things every day. The other thing that they've recently developed, which is really the archaeology of genocide. And that is that with ground penetrating radar and other new devices, you can see what's been plowed under at some of the death camps and even at some of the sites of, for example, the old synagogue in Auschwitz, the old synagogue in other communities, the tunnel in Ponar, the death gas chambers in Sobibor. We're able to see things before we dig that tell us what we're about to explore, and therefore you don't have to dig. You don't have to dig without knowing. But let me turn it back to Robert.
Yeah, I think that another piece for me, I'm actually going to give a presentation next week to a team that is creating a Holocaust museum in the Netherlands. And I'm actually giving a version of this presentation. That is, they have asked me, can you walk us through how you, plural, created the Auschwitz exhibition, because the director of that new exhibition, of that new Holocaust museum, has seen it and thought it would be good for the people developing it to basically get an idea how we thought about it. And since I'm doing it in Dutch, and Michael's Dutch is a little rusty, I understand, I will do it by myself. I think that the problem with the word Holocaust is that when you have that single word, it's almost like a Holocaust TM, trademark, it's like a brand. It's like this big single thing. But in fact, there are many Holocausts in a sense. At every nation, in almost every nation in Europe, the paths towards the ultimate slaughter is different. Very look out. Michael has worked with that. You've created a Holocaust museum in the Balkan. You know, in every country has different questions, different issues. And quite often, I think that you know, there are people, somewhere I think in North America, or maybe in Israel, we tend to see the forest, but sometimes forget about the trees, the very local dimension about the Holocaust, which is beautifully, I think, illustrated in that book, The Ravine, which is so local. It's so about a very particular community, and people from Slovakia who come into that community as part of the killing unit. In Europe, quite often, I feel that the historians are very much locked into their national narrative. And so they look at the trees and they don't know the forest. And also the problem is languages. You know, if you are, I mean, you need to know 26 languages or 27 languages in order to write, to understand the Holocaust at that continental level, because so many different countries with different languages, different traditions of scholarship were included. So for me, that in some way, Wendy Lauer's book is a fantastic illustration of what a single person can do in some way. But on the other side, I think it's also very important to in some way start to get a sense of how that totality, where both the trees and the forest are seen simultaneously in all of these different communities, to get, if not a consensus, but to actually get a larger conversation. Because the Dutch are still not talking to the French, the Dutch Holocaust historians, to the French Holocaust historians. We're not talking to the Polish Holocaust historians, and we're not talking to the people in Greece.
And let's also say that some scholarship is now confused and distorted by nationalist agendas. And this is the danger we're experiencing in places like Poland and Lithuania. There are a couple of books that have exploded the situation in Lithuania. You know, one woman discovered, she went to investigate her grandfather's glorious history as a Lithuanian patriot, and discovered that he was a Nazi murderer. And we experience this every day. And consequently, you need to maintain a certain balance in the whole thing. And you need also to be prepared, and this is not easy, to be open to the experience. And part of why we use banter an awful lot when we work on this is because the more open we are to the experience, the more we bleed. The more we bleed, the more we hurt. And if we don't bleed, then we can't judge how our audience is going to experience this. So consequently, in other times, we just banter and try to preserve ourselves from this, but have to realize that you and I and every visitor who goes through this exhibition has to be open to what they're about to experience.
And maybe I could add one more thing, because I think that this goes back to where the big challenge is. Of course, an incredible challenge that we all face is that the generation of survivor witnesses is passing right now. And I think that both at the level of institutions like the Museum of Jewish Heritage, but also as scholars, I mean, they have given us guidance. You know, they certainly held my hand in my early career. I mean, I was terribly afraid to offend a survivor, you know, an Auschwitz survivor in my work, but in some way I had to negotiate this as an Auschwitz historian. And when, you know, from time to time I would get the blessings of a survivor who said, you know, it's not exactly as I remember it, but you're on the right track, and I think go on with your work. That was very important for me personally. And I think that to realize that we are in some way stewards of a legacy that's going to be handed by them also, and the way we move forward with that legacy in their absence, I think is going to be a very big question, which we haven't yet fully resolved yet.
You just really succinctly described the mission of our museum, so I thank you for that. I want to be respectful of both of your time. but I
We're
just
not going anywhere, Drew. I'm in lockdown. I'm in a gray lockdown. We're still stuck at home.
Well, I just wanted to add that I've seen the exhibition, I've listened to parts of the audio guide, but both of which are remarkable, but truly there is nothing like hearing directly from the curators. So I cannot thank you enough. Is there anything else you'd like to share or add before we close?
Oh, we could go on for another hour and a half, so don't get us started on that, but thank you very much. And those of you who have not seen the exhibition who are in our listening audience, please try to see it before it leaves on May 2nd, or else come to Kansas City. There's a good jazz scene in Kansas City. There's also the Truman Library and even the Negro Leagues Baseball Hall of Fame. So a trip to Kansas City may be worthwhile merely to see the Auschwitz exhibition. But there are other things you can do.
If you can make it, since you're all members, and if you by any chance are living in New York, I'm going to drop the link into the chat to reserve your free member tickets. We have a private member hour, so you can see the exhibition when it's no crowds, no lines, nothing. It's really quite special right now if you can get here. But this was wonderful. Robert Jan, you did a program with us at the height of the pandemic in April 2020. And so this is just a really nice way to bookend this incredible exhibition. And I thank you both so much for your time and your generous research. We're so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Take care.